All right, let's dive into something really fascinating today.
Right.
We're going to be exploring the Virene's work, Cyborgs versus the Earth Goddess, men's domestication of women and animals, and female resistance.
Wow.
Quite a title, right?
Yeah, that's certainly provocative, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
And it kind of gets right to the heart of his main argument,
Okay.
which is this link he sees between the rise of patriarchal societies and, men's relationship with nature, specifically the domestication of animals.
Right.
So what are your initial thoughts on this connection that he's making?
Well, it's definitely a bold statement to make,
Yeah.
to challenge these conventional historical narratives. And Seenarine, he's a big name in women's studies. And he's not just looking at the historical treatment of women sort of in a vacuum.
Right.
He's really trying to bring in all these different fields together, anthropology, archaeology, mythology, to kind of create this bigger picture of how human societies have evolved over time.
So he's suggesting there was a time before this male dominance that we see.
Yes.
Before, the patriarchal model was really the norm.
Exactly.
Right.
He uses this term ecogynocentrism
Okay.
to describe a social structure where respect for nature and women's leadership were intertwined.
Interesting.
And, imagine early human societies where you had to be in tune with nature, for survival.
Right.
So valuing things like sustainability, collaboration,
Absolutely.
those would have been really important.
And that actually makes you think, if those values were so central to how they lived,
Yeah.
how did this shift even happen?
Yeah.
How did what he calls ecogynocentrism
Yeah.
give way over time to patriarchy?
That is the question, isn't it?
It really is.
I mean, that's what we're all trying to figure out. And that's where Seenarine's argument, it takes this really fascinating turn.
Okay.
He suggests that the domestication of animals, which we normally think of as this technological advancement, right, might actually have been one of the first steps that led us down this kind of hierarchical, dominance-based path for social structure.
Okay.
Think about it.
Yeah.
The act of domesticating an animal,
Right.
you're basically bending this entire other species to your will.
Right.
Could that have fostered like a mindset of control?
Okay.
And could that mindset have spread, first from animals to then how humans relate to each other, and specifically the subjugation of women?
It's a pretty powerful idea to grapple with, this idea that, domestication itself
Yeah.
could have led to these, really harmful power structures.
Mm-hmm.
But how do we go from this idea to actual evidence of this happening?
Well, this is where Seenarine points to a shift that's happening in legal codes.
Okay.
Things like the Hammurabi Code were
Yeah.
one of the earliest examples we have of written law.
Mm.
And the goal was to establish order. But when you look closely, certain laws start treating women and animals in a very similar way
Okay.
as property. For example, there are punishments for someone who harms another person's animals.
Right.
But those punishments were very similar, almost the same as if you had harmed a woman.
Wow.
Almost as if they held the same status, as possessions.
That's disturbing to see this clear parallel in a legal context, at least.
It is, and this is where it gets even more complicated.
So essentially what you're saying is he's arguing that these tools of civilization that we often think of as positive,
Yes.
the domestication of animals, the development of writing,
Yes.
may have actually been used to create and solidify this power dynamic that really disadvantaged women
Exactly.
and ultimately changed humanity's relationship with the natural world.
You've got it.
Wow, this is already making me rethink a lot of what I thought I knew about prehistory.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is.
Yeah.
So we've kind of established this potential connection, right, between domestication of animals, the rise of literacy, and then this shift to patriarchal societies.
Right.
But were there any voices of dissent during this time?
That's a great
This
question.
supposed great fall, as it's often called, from this more balanced way of being.
Right, right.
Did women have any agency or influence at all as these societal structures were changing so dramatically?
You raise a really important point because it wasn't like complete female suppression. Even as these patriarchal structures were emerging, women weren't just passive bystanders.
Okay.
Think about the Egyptian goddess Mot, the embodiment of justice and balance, or the Greek goddesses Dike, representing justice, and Astrea, who's associated with innocence and purity.
Right.
And their continued reverence, even within a patriarchal system, suggests that there's this lingering yearning for a time when those values held more sway.
So even as male-dominated hierarchies were kind of taking root, these goddesses were still there
Exactly.
as these powerful reminders of a different way of being.
Yes, a different way of structuring society.
Okay.
And it wasn't just in the realm of mythology either.
Okay.
Even during the Bronze Age, as these patriarchal structures were on the rise, women were challenging the norms, expressing themselves, leaving their mark on history.
Tell me more about these defiant figures.
Okay.
Who were these women who refused to be silenced during this time?
Well, there's Enheduanna, for example, from ancient Sumer. She's considered the earliest known author and poet in the world.
Wow.
And her hymns to the goddess Inanna give us this really unique glimpse into the power of female voices during this period.
Fascinating.
And then, of course, there's Sappho, the
Right.
Greek poet.
Mhm.
And her work was so celebrated that it actually transcended, her time.
Wow.
And her poems, they're filled with passion, emotional depth.
Mm.
They really challenge conventional notions of love and desire in a world that's, increasingly dominated by male perspectives.
It's just incredible to think about these women
Yeah.
using the power of language right,
Yeah.
to express themselves at a time when their voices were becoming, increasingly marginalized.
Mm-hmm.
It definitely adds another layer of complexity to this whole narrative
Absolutely.
of this shift towards patriarchy.
Right.
It wasn't like a clean break.
No.
It was more this gradual process
Yeah.
with pockets of resistance, subversion all along the way.
Right.
And it really highlights how dynamic the interplay between genders was throughout history.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that history is never simple.
Never.
One-sided.
Right. And that's what makes exploring these alternative narratives so fascinating
Absolutely.
and important, I think,
I agree.
to understand the full picture.
Yes.
We've just scratched the surface here
We have.
of Seenarine's work.
Yes.
There's so much more to uncover.
Absolutely.
From the environmental implications of all of this
Right?
to, potentially reclaiming those lost feminine principles
It's all connected.
in the modern world.
It is.
So much to think about.
Definitely.
It's like we're drawing a line from those first domesticated animals
Right.
to the ecological imbalances we're seeing in the world today.
Yeah.
How does Seenarine actually connect those dots?
So he argues that this act of viewing animals as something to be controlled
Okay.
instead of as beings within our ecosystem
Mhm.
fundamentally changed how humans were relating to nature. And this view where humans, and specifically men, because they're the ones who solidified their dominance, right,
Right.
saw themselves as separate from and superior to nature.
Okay.
That's what he calls the anthropocentric worldview.
And he's saying that's at the root of the environmental crisis.
Yeah, that's a big part of his argument.
Wow.
He believes that this mindset of dominance, which started, maybe with domesticating animals,
Right.
then extended to women, to the natural world,
Yeah.
has led to this disconnect where we don't see ourselves as being subject to those same natural laws that govern everything else.
So where do we go from here?
That's the big question.
I mean, are we doomed to just repeat these patterns of dominance?
Yeah, necessarily.
Okay.
See, Seenarine's work, it isn't about pointing fingers or blaming anyone.
Okay.
It's about understanding why things are the way they are.
Okay.
He believes that if we can acknowledge the flaws in this anthropocentric worldview, that's how we can start to shift towards a more harmonious way of being.
What would that look like, practically speaking?
Right.
I mean, does he give us any concrete steps that we can take?
He does.
Okay.
He really emphasizes reevaluating and reclaiming what he calls feminine principles.
Okay. And by feminine principles, he means.
Things like cooperation, empathy, a more holistic understanding of how interconnected everything is.
Interesting.
And these are actually the values that were central to those early ecogynocentric societies he talks about.
So these qualities that we often perceive as soft or maybe even weaknesses,
Right, especially in a patriarchal system.
right, are actually crucial for our survival.
He would say so, yes.
Okay, so it's not about going back to some romanticized past
Right.
or excluding men.
No, not at all.
It's about all of us, men and women, embracing these values.
Interesting.
Seenarine, he really challenges those traditional gender roles.
Okay.
And he advocates for a world where cooperation, mutual respect, those become the guiding principles.
It's a really powerful vision.
But I have to admit, it seems like a really daunting task,
Yeah.
given how entrenched these patriarchal systems are in everything.
It's a huge challenge, for sure.
Yeah.
But Seenarine is a big believer in the power of individual action,
Okay.
leading to bigger societal change.
Okay.
He reminds us that even small changes we make in our daily lives can have a ripple effect,
So it's about aligning our actions with the values we want to see in the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For example, he talks about being more conscious consumers,
Okay.
supporting businesses that, actually operate ethically, sustainably.
But putting our money where our values are.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It might seem like a small act of defiance,
Right.
but choosing to support businesses that align with these, feminine principles of sustainability, cooperation, that can contribute to a bigger shift in consciousness.
Now, you mentioned this striking image of the cyborg earlier.
Yeah.
It's in the title of his book.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that metaphor a little bit? Who are these cyborgs?
Yeah.
What do they represent in this whole context?
It's such a great question, and I think it's a brilliant metaphor.
Yeah.
For seenarine, the cyborg really embodies that disconnected, dominance-driven masculinity that he sees as being at the core of so many problems that we face.
Interesting.
So picture this being so reliant on technology, so focused on control and power, that it's lost touch with the natural world,
Okay.
with empathy,
Right.
with those feminine principles that we've been talking about,
I'm starting to see how this all ties together.
right?
So are we supposed to dismantle these cyborgs?
Wow.
Or at least help them reconnect to a more empathetic, interconnected way of being?
I think it's less about dismantling and more about reintegration.
Okay.
Seenarine really believes that a lot of these harmful behaviors we see stem from this deep sense of disconnect
Okay.
from nature, from our emotions, even from each other.
Right.
And reclaiming these feminine principles, it allows for that reintegration, that bridging of the divide.
So it's about recognizing that these qualities, they're not inherently feminine.
Right.
They're not masculine.
Exactly.
They're human qualities.
Yes.
That we all have the potential to embody.
Absolutely. And that's a huge part of his message.
Yeah.
It's not about one gender being better than the other.
Right.
It's about recognizing the value of both the masculine and the feminine, and how do we integrate those
Right.
into a more balanced, holistic way of being.
It's about rediscovering those parts of ourselves that maybe have been suppressed or devalued by these rigid systems that we live in.
Absolutely. And he would argue that by reintegrating these parts of ourselves, we can start to heal not only our relationship with the planet,
Right.
but also our relationships with each other.
So how do we begin to dismantle these ingrained systems?
Okay.
Where do we even begin to untangle something that's so deeply woven into everything?
Well, seenarine believes it starts with awareness. Understanding how these patriarchal systems actually work, how they show up in our language, our institutions,
Our relationships.
your very ways of thinking. Yeah.
It's like we're all caught in this web
Yes.
that's been spun for thousands of years,
Right.
and we don't even realize it.
We're often totally unaware.
Yeah.
And it's like any web.
Right.
We have to identify the threads, understand their purpose before we can even think about untangling them.
Okay.
And he wants us to question everything.
What does he mean by that?
Well, why are certain traits valued over others?
Right.
Where did these hierarchies come from?
Okay.
Whose interests do they serve?
Okay.
By asking these tough questions, that's how we start to unravel those threads and envision new ways of being.
It's like becoming aware of our own programming almost, right?
Yeah, like those unconscious biases we've internalized.
Right, exactly.
And those patterns of thought, behavior that keep these systems going.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
It is, but awareness is key.
Okay.
It's that first step.
Right.
Only then can we make different choices,
Right.
Challenge those old patterns and actually start to create new narratives.
Which makes me think so much of this comes back to storytelling, doesn't it?
It really does.
The stories we tell ourselves, the stories our cultures pass down, they shape how we see the world
They really do, yeah.
and how we fit into it.
Absolutely.
It's like, remember earlier we were talking about that shift from oral traditions to written text? It feels like we're kind of still grappling with the consequences of that,
I think so.
Seenarine argues we need to kind of reclaim that power of storytelling, create new narratives that celebrate cooperation,
Right,
interconnectedness.
Respect for all forms of life, yeah.
It's about writing a new story, not
Yeah.
just accepting the one we've inherited, right?
Exactly. And those new stories, they're not just about words on a page.
Yeah.
It's about living those values every day.
Okay, so what does that look like, practically speaking?
Right.
We've talked about being conscious consumers. Are there other ways to embody these principles in our daily lives?
Definitely. He's a big advocate for challenging power structures wherever we find them at
Yeah.
work,
Mhm.
in our communities,
Okay.
even in our families.
So it's not just about women demanding equality. It's about men also examining their roles.
Exactly.
Okay, and working to change things.
Absolutely. It's about realizing that dismantling these systems, it benefits everyone.
Right, not just those who have been marginalized by them.
Right. And understanding that all these issues are interconnected.
Okay,
We can't really address environmental destruction without tackling social injustice.
right.
We can't dismantle patriarchy without looking at our relationship with nature.
Right, it's all connected.
It's one big interconnected web, right?
It really is.
We have to address it as such.
So how do we shift from this mindset of dominance and control to one of reciprocity and respect?
That is the question. And Cyrene would say it starts within each of us.
Okay.
It starts by questioning the stories we've been told, embracing new narratives,
Okay.
and ultimately rewriting the very code of how we live.
Now, you mentioned earlier that he also advocates for things like shifting to a more plant-based diet.
Yeah.
What role does he see our food choices playing in all of this?
He connects it to that larger system of dominance and exploitation.
Okay.
Specifically, he talks a lot about the factory farming industry, where profit is put above animal welfare and environmental sustainability.
Right.
That's the anthropocentric worldview in action.
So he's challenging us to really consider the ethical implications
Absolutely.
and the environmental consequences
Of everything we consume, yeah.
of our food choices.
It all has a ripple effect.
It does.
What we eat matters.
Okay, so what you're saying is, he's not saying everyone has to become vegan overnight,
No, not at all.
but it's about being more aware
Yes, more mindful
where our food comes from
Yeah.
and the impact it has.
on the planet, on other beings.
Right, moving towards a way of eating that aligns with those values of respect and interconnection.
Yes.
This has been such a thought-provoking conversation.
It has.
Really challenging to rethink these things.
It's a lot to sit with, for sure.
It is, but it's so important.
It is.
You know, to have these conversations, to
Ultra
really
fun.
grapple with these ideas, especially if we want to create a different kind of future.
I agree.
So for our listeners who are feeling inspired, maybe a little overwhelmed, but wanting to delve deeper,
Right.
where would you suggest they go from here?
I always recommend going straight to the source.
Okay.
Pick up a copy of Cyborgs versus the Earth Goddess.
It's a powerful read.
It is.
Intense at times, but so worth it.
Absolutely. Lots to unpack, but it'll stay with you.
It really will. And you know what?
What's that?
The deep dive doesn't end here
Right.
for all of you listening.
Keep exploring.
Exactly. Keep asking those tough questions.
Have those conversations.
Right. And let's work together to create a future
Yes.
where both the Earth Goddess and, yes, even the cyborg within us
We need both.
can thrive.
Absolutely.
Until next time.